In this episode, we're looking at Dana Elmendorf's 2025 novel, Gravebirds. So, Gravebirds. Yeah, this is a really interesting novel. Um, it's it's a hard one to discuss in some ways. I mean, on the one hand, its narrative is, I think, a fairly straightforward one, and yet at the same time, it's dealing with some incredibly complex issues, and is set up as a mystery. It's also described as a Southern Gothic. This is what attracted me to it. As I've mentioned when I was looking at Del Sandine's This Cursed House, I've been in the market lately for Southern Gothic novels. Speaking of which, because I am writing a Southern Gothic, I've been doing research, academic research on the form of and ideas around the Southern Gothic, and I may very well have to do an episode effectively as a video essay here and there on some of the papers that I'm reading, just because they are really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting work out there on the concept of the Southern Gothic as well as of course, the Gothic itself. And I will definitely do an episode at some point in the not too distant future on the Gothic and what the Gothic means generally, what it means to me, so forth and so on. This novel, I think, does fit more or less the most basic elemental criteria of it is set in the South. It's set in South Carolina, the town of Hawthorne, South Carolina. It does involve at least a couple of big old houses, but it does involve a ghost, but at the same time, it's not really dealing with the South, as it were. There is no reason ultimately why this novel couldn't have been set in any other part of the United States, or indeed, a number of other countries. So there's nothing specifically Southern about it. I mean, it does have Southern touches, little aspects here and there. At one point, the main character, Hollis Sutherland, she does, and there is something, rather Southern about that name, Hollis Sutherland. She does mention at one point things like, she clearly didn't inherit the Southern gene for cooking. But frankly, as someone who has lived in multiple countries, I have heard those kinds of descriptions for the same exact thing, like, being a good cook, be described as an Irish trait or a Southern trait in the South, or, whatever. And it's like, an Italian thing. And it's like, there's no nationality to these things. There's no regionality to a lot of these things. Having a grandmother who was a great cook happens in many parts of the world. My own Southern grandmother was a terrible cook, and she would have been the first to say so. In fact, she did say so on many occasions. She was a dreadful cook, and if this were the forum for it, I could regale you with stories of some really bad meals. I loved her dearly. Please, don't get me wrong. I adored my grandmother, but she could not cook to save her life. So that isn't a Southern gene. It is not inherent to Southern grandmothers. And little touches like that, plus, mentions of characters' Southern accents, it's not enough to make this Southern. I think it needs to have more about it that is specific to the South's history, culture, so forth and so on. And as much as I did enjoy Gravebirds, I don't think it was somehow magically or inherently Southern. The book has also been described, and when I was sort of looking up things about it, sort of information about its publication history, just little bits like that, I kept coming across a description, I think probably coming from its publisher, that it was, and I quote, it is this, that Gravebirds is the Southern Book Club's guide to slaying vampires meets Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And these descriptions often emphasize, in particular, the arrival of a man in Hawthorne, South Carolina, which happens at the beginning of the book, a man by the name of Cain Landry, who becomes a hugely important character in the narrative of the novel, as well as in Hollis's own life story. But it's not his story. He is not the main character. He is important to the story. He is important to the mystery. He becomes a major stumbling block, at least, early on, to Hollis's long-held and long-cherished plans, and throws a real wrench in the works for her. But that description of the Southern Book Club's guide to slaying vampires meets Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil just does not work. Now, I will confess I have not yet read Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Boy, that is a long title. I have, years ago, read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Also have seen the film version of it starring, I think it was John Cusack. Loved the book. Great, enjoyed the film very much. But it's not, this book is not that, except that both of them are about, both of them have a mystery at the heart of them. And both have as an important figure in the stories a suave, wealthy, sophisticated gentleman. Okay. And that's not that's not enough for me. But saying that, and I'll just give a little, as spoiler-free as possible synopsis. This is all going to be stuff that comes out very early in the novel, and explains the title of the novel and so forth. I think that this will get you more of an idea of what this novel's about, what themes it's dealing with, and why it is. And I want to say, right now, as I think I've already said, I really enjoyed this novel. I definitely recommend this novel, but I think it's important going into it to understand it is not as described by the publisher. It is not a Southern Gothic mystery, but it is a mystery. It is set in a little town in South Carolina, and it is a good read. Okay? It is definitely a good read. Now, basically how the story goes. So again, the title is Gravebirds, and this refers to these little birds that Hollis begins to be able to see. They are invisible to the overwhelming majority of people, not to everybody, but to the overwhelming majority of people. And yet they are, they can be found all around us, though they particularly inhabit graveyards, the last places where someone lived and or maybe died, and they are invisible. Okay, they are all different. They are invisible. They are all different breeds of birds. And she mentions, I think, sort of finches and titmice. I'm not a bird person. I don't, they're fine. Birds are fine outside. They kind of scare me. Kind of scare me a little. Maybe the film had too great an impact on me. I don't know. But they do sort of scare me a little. So I'm not terribly knowledgeable of them. But she sees, ravens. She sees all different kinds of birds. And they are chained to a spot in the ground and or to an object. And she is able to see these grave birds because when she was about 11 years old, she and her grandfather were in the car coming back or heading back to their home from being in town. And I'll not go into all the details of that because that's kind of important. And it's potentially spoiler-ish. But they're on their way home from town, and they are in a terrible car accident. Her grandfather is killed, and she is thrown from the car, ends up in a ditch in water, and is underwater and dead for a good half hour. I think it's 33 minutes altogether is the number that's given in the book. And she is actually rescued by a man who is passing by. He's able to save her life, but not her grandfather's. And she's a bit of, as a child, she's sort of seen as kind of a medical miracle because she does, she is dead for over half an hour, but she is brought back to life. And unbeknownst to almost everyone else, apart from the man who saves her, whose name is Royce, and he becomes a very important figure in her life. And she, refers to him by the time the novel starts when she's in her 20s. She refers to him as Uncle Royce. He has become a kind of, fairy godfather to her in a sense. Her family is fairly poor, and they are especially poor after her grandfather's death. He is extremely rich. And so he takes the whole of the Sutherland family, and in particular Hollis, under his wing. Pun slightly intended, because what he realizes is that Hollis is able to see these grave birds, and it turns out he is too. That he likewise died briefly and was resuscitated, and has now developed that ability to see these birds. And so he kind of sort of mentors her to a degree in sort of dealing with these birds. And what she learns is that if you hold out your hand and let the bird come into your hands, you will then see, well, it depends. You'll see either the death of the person to whom that grave bird, is linked, or you'll see maybe a memory of their greatest regret, or, a particularly crucial moment in their lives, though it seems usually to be connected to regret. And these, once she's able to sort of take in this information, this memory or whatever, it seems to be enough, and it usually allows the grave bird to be released, and they usually fly off, and who knows where they go, but they're no longer chained. And she sometimes finds them when they're very recently formed, I guess is how you'd put it. Others that have been there for a very long time, sometimes they're sort of laying on the ground, just worn out, weak, faint, and her being able to take them and to take in their memories, or what their feelings or whatever it is that they're holding on to for this deceased person, it revives them and allows them to have their freedom. Now, this is a gift that she has kept to herself. She does seem to have told her two best friends growing up. They are all, of course, now adults in their 20s. They seem to, there's two young women who also live in the town. They seem to accept this about her. They seem to believe her. They at least believe that she believes it. But, they don't really understand it. Uncle Royce does. And he and Hollis are very close. As I say, he becomes a kind of honorary uncle, a godfather of sorts to her, and really helps her in a number of ways. Her grandmother is a good person, and her grandmother is the one who largely raises Hollis and her younger brothers, who are twins. Her mother is alive, but is not a particularly good or reliable person. And in fact, she, at some point before the start of the novel, has actually taken out several credit cards, I think it is, in Hollis's name, run up a bunch of debt, and Hollis has to go through a great many sort of things with the courts and with the bank and all in order to get that sort of taken off of her credit history and to, her liability for that to be removed, and her mother actually pay the penalty for that. It's, her father he and her mother have divorced. He lives in another town. She has not disowned him, but he is not a part of her life. He's there, but he's not an active part of her life. Uncle Royce, as she always refers to him, however, he was. And as Hollis grows up, she, long story short, has hit upon the idea that she wants to be an event planner. She's good at it. She enjoys it. And she is beginning, at the start of the novel, she has begun building a company, an event planning company, particularly amongst, the sort of elites of Hawthorne. And she is living in the greenhouse on Uncle Royce's estate. It was converted 3 years earlier, or several years earlier, into a kind of studio apartment for her when Uncle Royce was very ill and was dying. And he sets this all up for her because, he says, well, no young woman wants to have to live in the same house as an old man. And she kind of figures, he also didn't want her to see him at his worst, as he was dying. He has died, and he has essentially left her the right to buy his house within 3 years. And, if she doesn't buy it, then his estranged daughters will be able to take possession of the house and sell it. Now, why he does this is never explained. Why he doesn't just leave her the house outright, the author never ever says, and I don't understand why that is. It's a bit of a strange decision. And it's certainly not what I would do. If I were rich and, my own children wanted nothing to do with me, and they were perfect, they had plenty of money and they were well set in life, and I had this, poor young girl who I had sort of adopted as a kind of niece/daughter, I'd just leave her my house. It's simple as that. But that's not what he does, and why that is never ever explained. It's not even like it occurs to anybody, to Elmendorf, the author. Certainly doesn't seem to have occurred to any of her, or editors or anybody to say, hey, why not put that in there? So it's a big hole, I think, in the novel, because it seems out of character for Uncle Royce, from what we get to know of him through her memories of him, when she's a child in particular, and how kind and how supportive he is of her and her family. But, the 3 years is almost up. She's just got a few weeks left of it. She is taking jobs here and there. She's been putting together a big proposal for a big event in the town that's a big gala, fundraising gala for the Hawthorne family, as in, the people the town is named after, who have this church, and they send out missionaries, and it's a big deal. And she's a little bit embarrassed to be working with them because her grandmother despises these people, says they're horrible, evil, all that, but she just thinks her grandmother's, and she sees them as, this is a huge opportunity for her, because it's not just going to make a lot of money for her, it's going to establish her event planning business for the town and for the great and the good of the town. So, and she is very much she very much believes that the place to do this event will be Uncle Royce's house. She is very excited to do this. She is, she's been going back and forth with the bank. They've been giving her, oh, we need this bit of paper. We need this bit of paper, that bit of paper, whatever. We need this affidavit. We need this signed. We need this approved. And she's been back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with the bank for weeks and weeks and weeks by the time we meet her. And she's just about to go for her latest meeting at the bank and she's at the hairdresser's. Her friend, who is a very successful hairdresser, is doing her hair and getting her ready for this appointment. And there's a bit of a commotion outside, and they see this very, very handsome, extremely well-dressed, sophisticated, obviously very wealthy man walking down the street. People are, greeting him. They clearly know who he is. And everybody in the hairdresser is just, wow, look how handsome he is. Well, Hollis notices him, but she doesn't notice him. She notices the grave bird on his shoulder. So this is something she has never seen happen before. It absolutely throws her. It seems to sort of throw off the balance of the town or the universe or something, because there's a bit of a tremor that hits the town. And, but then he goes into another building. She finishes, in the hair, getting herself together. She goes off to her appointment at the bank. And long story short, and this is all stuff we find out very early on, this Uncle Royce's daughters have managed to put in enough barriers and work with the bank to put in enough barriers to be able to sell Royce's house ahead of the deadline to this man, Cain Landry. Okay. And Hollis finds this out not that day, but the next day, when a tree comes crashing into the roof of her greenhouse. And she realizes there are all these people out there doing, cutting down trees and ripping up the garden and all of that. And she finds out that the house has been sold and that this man, Cain Landry, is moving in. And she and Cain immediately lock horns. They really, she, I think, has every right to be angry. She's certainly in shock. She's in shock that he thinks she's a squatter and she should get out of the place that she's lived for 3 years, that he has managed to somehow come in and with cash buy this house that she's been counting on as the sort of centerpiece for her event planning business, as well as a place that she is incredibly sentimentally attached to. And, she's just overwhelmed. So she does manage, through her connections with some of the people in the town, to get him persuaded to give her at least to the end of the month. And then she is able to, and I won't go into all the details, but they do at least work out their problems. And in fact, they end up developing a very strong and indeed romantic relationship. And, and this becomes hugely important. Now, I feel like I'm about to go into spoiler territory here. So I'll kind of cut to the chase by saying what we find is that Hollis starts noticing more of these grave birds. She starts to realize that Cain, she sees evidence of a little ghost girl on her property, or in her greenhouse. Is not her property, but in her greenhouse, it seems that this little girl has drowned. There's water that sort of pools around her in places suddenly and mysteriously where it shouldn't. And it also appears that Cain can see and communicate with her. we find out that he too has had not exactly a sort of death, sort of a near death experience in the way that Hollis has. But he's not been far off from it. He did nearly die as a child, and it's all a bit sort of strange and mysterious the way he survives this brush with death. But he's well past it now. He has become an incredibly rich successful man, and he is now living with his godmother Paloma, who we're given to understand is a very, very sophisticated, very beautiful older woman, and she has a very unusual accent. She speaks in a very unusual language. She also speaks fluent English, but she speaks to Cain usually in this other language, and Hollis can never quite identify it. She's not sure, doesn't think it's Spanish, maybe it's Portuguese. Paloma does eventually sort of say, she's from South America, but we don't get a lot about her at this stage. But it does materialize that she does have a kind of connection with the Hawthorne family, but not in the way, not with the actual Hawthornes who are there in the town. And this is at the heart of the mystery of who the Hawthornes really are, what the Hawthornes are up to, who Cain Landry is, how he is connected to Hawthorne. It's this, and the Gravebirds are part of what helps Hollis to solve this mystery. If she didn't have this ability to see the Gravebirds, to take them in her hands and experience the memories and so forth that these Gravebirds give her, and if she weren't also quite an intelligent person and also pretty good at research and able to use various sources, records and things in order to find the information that she needs to help put the pieces of the puzzle together. A mystery that a lot of people didn't realize existed would not be solved, and things would not work out well for her, for Cain, for Paloma, for the town. Okay. I'll leave that at that, leave the sort of description of the novel to that. Because if I say any more, it really does get too much into sort of full-on spoiler territory. But I do want to talk about what this novel is dealing with, in a thematic sense, because it's dealing with ideas of loss, grief, regret, forgiveness. Forgiveness is a huge one. And as I say, the Gravebirds themselves are often, not every single time, but typically they are manifestations of a dead person's greatest regret. It may not even be a big deal. For instance, she finds out that her grandfather's Gravebird shows her that his greatest regret at the time of his death was that he and Hollis had been quarreling in the car on the way home. And he was upset that he had yelled at her. Even though she was in trouble, she deserved to have him get on to her and to yell at her a bit for something she had done. And, anyone would do that to a child in their care if they had done something wrong. And, but he regrets this, that this is the last conversation he has with his granddaughter, and that, but she has to learn to forgive herself for her grandfather's death, even though she isn't responsible in any way. She feels responsible because he wouldn't have gone into town to pick her up if she hadn't gotten into trouble. So as a child, she blames herself for his death because otherwise he would have been home. And she, has to learn to let that go even into adulthood. She's still carrying that. She has to learn to forgive her mother. That doesn't mean forget what her mother has done, but she needs to let that go as well for her own peace of mind. Early on, she has to, forgive Cain for his initial behavior toward her. She does that, and it's one of the smaller things she has to forgive. There's nothing really said about her forgiving Uncle Royce for not just leaving her the house. But, you know, I, he didn't have to leave it to her. He didn't. He left her essentially first refusal on the house and gave her a time limit of 3 years to buy the house. And she just didn't manage to do it. And she was, strung along, and was effectively prevented from doing that, not by him, but by the bank, by his estranged daughters, that sort of thing. But, she has to learn to let that go as well. She has to learn to grieve what she has been through, in a sense, to sort of grieve and find acceptance for this ability of hers, which she's, always been a bit weird and reluctant about, as you would. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Perseverance. I mean, certainly by not being able to buy Uncle Royce's house and have to go through what she goes through in order to eventually get her event planning business on track and actually build something successful, it takes a great deal of perseverance. Solving the mystery that she stumbles onto with Cain Landry's arrival in the town and everything that unfolds from that. That takes perseverance, persistence. Cain has, and I can't say what exactly he has to forgive because that would be huge spoilers. That would give away the ending of the mystery. But he has to let go of his regrets, to, deal with his own grief for his losses in his life, and to forgive certain people in Hawthorne for the wrongs that have been done to him and to his family, to his parents and his siblings, in order to move on with his life and to find happiness. So dealing with all, and of course that, as I say, that is what these grave birds are all about. They are manifestations of grief, of loss, of regret, of suffering and pain. Hollis doesn't mention any happy grave birds. I never saw anything. I don't remember anything from the book, and I've read it twice now, that says that there were happy grave birds, that she picks one up and is like, oh, what a lovely memory. At best, they're strange and confusing. More often than not, they are really upsetting, sometimes incredibly painful, disturbing memories of the moment of someone's death, traumatic death. And, by learning to forgive, she is able to find balance in her life. She is able to achieve her goals, maybe not exactly as she initially pictured them, but nonetheless to succeed in what she wants to do. So the book does end on a good note. It does end well for all those involved. And it's an interesting way to do a mystery. So it certainly has supernatural, paranormal elements. It is not scary. I would not call this a scary novel at all. There are occasionally disturbing memories and things, particularly via the grave birds, of course. But there's nothing frightening about this. So if you're looking for something creepy or scary or anything like that, you will not find this here. But if you want a good story with an interesting twist that delves into these kinds of bleaker emotions, as I say, grief, regret, pain, loss, so forth, then absolutely. And there is happiness, there's love, familial love, romantic love, all of these kinds, friendship, good friendships, all of that sort of thing as well. I don't want to say that this is a bleak book. It is absolutely not. But even though it is described as I say, a Southern Gothic mystery, it is not. Still a good book, but I think when people have said they didn't care for the book, some of whom did say, they persisted and then they found they enjoyed it, particularly the second half of the book. I think that's why. It's because that description of, the Southern Vampire, was it the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires meets Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil is just completely off the mark. And this emphasis on this mysterious man, Cain Landry, coming into town, and sort of imply what if he's the devil or something like that. It really just sets you up for an entirely different book from Gravebirds. Okay. So, I guess as far as, the story itself, the book itself, I'd give it 4 out of 5. 3.5 to 4, probably 4 out of 5. I certainly wouldn't give it 5 out of 5 because I think, as I say, there are too many sort of plot holes that we could have done with an explanation for that would have helped to flesh things out in this world and sort of the rules of this world. But they're not deal breakers, okay? So I 3.5 to 4 out of 5. So yeah, if it sounds, hopefully my description of the book, my analysis of it, gives you a better idea of what it's like. And if you do read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But yeah, so that's Gravebirds by Dana Elmendorf, 2025 novel. So that's all from me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, your evening, whatever point in the day this is for you. And I'll see you next Friday for a new episode. Bye.